Um, we recently launched this book, Brancusi in New York, 1913-2013, which was released in November in New York on the occasion, also at the same time, as the opening of a show at the Paul Kasmin Gallery, a non-commercial show displaying 5 sculptures by Brancusi, like a mirror, in a way, of the 5 sculptures Brancusi presented initially in 1913, 100 years ago, on the occasion of the first Armory show. Arthur B. Davis, who was the president of the first Armory show, used to say that Brancusi was the kind of artist for who he imagined the Armory show. The Armory show in 1913, as you all know, and Matthew also can talk about that, had the ambition to propose a large panorama of the world creation in 1913. And it happened that Brancusi, who was at that time 37 years old, a Romanian-born artist living in Paris since 1904, really appeared on the world art stage. And following the Armory show presentation, he got in 1914 in New York his first solo show at 38 years old. And since then, and the book is describing this success story, incredible, of Brancusi in New York, since 1913 till his death in 1957, he will in fact have shows and collectors mostly and only in New York. Never in his lifetime, and he passed away at 81, he got any gallery or any show in Paris and in Europe. New York, as he said later, he said, I couldn't have produced all that, even I couldn't have existed without the Americans. And what gave me the idea of this book was to focus on such a symbol of the greatest modern sculptor, the artist Brancusi, who, as André Breton said in 1942, directed sculpture on a new path, one of the inventors of contemporary art, in a way. How strong was the symbol that such an important artist made 90% of his sales during his lifetime in New York, where was only exhibited by New York galleries and bought by New York collectors. And his only museum show during his lifetime was in 1955 at the Guggenheim. During this time, his only presentation in an institution in Europe, in France, during his lifetime, was at the Musée National d'Art Moderne in 1955, the same year, but within a group show entitled 50 Years of American Art, collection of MoMA. That to say that clearly Brancusi, till the end of his life, was seen paradoxically by the European stage as an American artist. I found some articles from 1928 in France of eminent art critics of that time, saying basically this artist, it says that Americans are wild about him but it will never be the case in France, was saying Louis Vaucel, eminent art critic at that time. So the book is basically, as in the first part, the story, the amazing story of Brancusi in New York, the city who really made his career. In a second chapter, I tried to study and to count the influence of New York and of his American friends and collectors and gallerists and ideas on his work, especially because when he first visited New York in 1926, he immediately said, "Manhattan is my large-scale studio." Why? Because seeing the skyline and the skyscrapers, he imagined like the mirror of his endless columns, which will be, of course, one of the icons of his work. And I count also how during this trip in 1926, he started to work with the New York architect William Lescas about what will be a dream at the end of the day, because never realized, of erecting in Manhattan a building in the shape of his endless column, in shining steel and glass, where people could inhabit. And this project from 1926, he will work on that project till 1955, till the end, always thinking, it's like his chef-d'œuvre inconnu, in a way. And it's very moving. Also, I count how he worked about a project for the Seagram building on Park Avenue. Miss Van der Rohe wanted to display a grand coq in steel in the front of the Seagram building. Also, because of it was at the end of his life, and Brancusi was too weak to pursue this project. And in fact, this grand coq today in steel is visible at the Gianada Foundation in Martigny, in Switzerland, in this sculpture park. Then, in a third chapter, I tried to talk about how much Brancusi brought an influence, brought to New York, and how much he influenced the contemporary American stage. And we have a lot of testimonies from that influence. And I think that even if you walk through the fair, you can see sometimes in some sculptures, and I think of, for example, the Jeff Koons very shining sculpture, how much relevant Brancusi art is today to understand the contemporary creation. Dan Flavin dedicated his first neon sculptures in 1963 to Brancusi. And when people ask him why this sculpture is entitled Parallèle, Diagonale 1963 to Constantin Brancusi, he said that when he saw the polished bronzes of Brancusi, he discovered a work of art in which light and the material are one. And he said, my neon sculpture, that's the thing. Same with Carl André, the Lever 66. He said, this is the endless column by Brancusi down to the ground. Donald Judd, we can talk also about Robert Morris, who did his thesis actually on Brancusi. Noguchi, before that, Noguchi, who discovered Brancusi. He had the chance at the Brummer Gallery. Joseph Brummer was the gallerist, one of the gallerists of Brancusi, and he discovered the Brancusi during a show at the Brummer Gallery in 1928. Then after, he got a grant from the Guggenheim, actually, foundation, or later to go to study with Brancusi. He became his assistant, and you can see the difference between Noguchi works before he worked with Brancusi and after, when really he discovered his style thanks to this approach. Many other examples are quoted. I won't read the whole book. It was just to present you, to summarize the idea of the book, and mostly all that story is not, and I would like Mathieu to comment that and to give his opinion on that, but for me, I think that all this story is not an anecdote. It could be such like a accident of the history. But I would like to ask also Mathieu how much he think, or not, like me, that this symbol could maybe embody or symbolize the shift at a certain time of the 20th century, the shift of the capital of art between Paris to New York. What do you think, Mathieu?
Well, I think that starting with the Armory show and with the arrival of the European avant-garde at our shores is a good way of setting up this idea of an international or transatlantic dialogue, and that's certainly the frame of your book, and I think it's kind of a fascinating capsule on a larger story. In a way, Brancusi is an exemplary French artist of his time. He's not the only one who traveled to New York in the 20s and 30s, and he's not the only one who found a special market in New York. One of his close friends and associates, the painter Léger, was another one who traveled here, had exhibitions here, and especially in the 1930s when, with the international stock market crash and the drying up to a certain extent of some of the patronage opportunities for modern artists in France, New York seemed like and America seemed like a natural source of clients and of exposure and so forth. So the years that we're talking about for Brancusi being collected, first in the 20s by John Quinn, then in the 20s and 30s by the Ahrensbergs, eventually by Peggy Guggenheim, by a whole group of American collectors, is a story which is also played out in some of the great modern artists of the same time. Second point, Brancusi is exemplary because there's a kind of romance of New York in his thinking, which other of his colleagues, again, Léger is a good example, Le Corbusier, the architect, is another good example, a kind of romance of New York. And of course, from a Parisian perspective, in the interwar period, New York, as it is today, is a kind of mixture of reality and fantasy and mythology, and certainly a symbol of a new world and of new possibilities. And if you read in this wonderful catalog, the few extracts of statements that Brancusi made about America and what it meant to him, or if you read some of the other travelers, Léger again wrote travel writing about his several trips. Some of the critics who wrote about Brancusi also were lovers of a kind of idea of America. The French writer Paul Morand, who was a great writer of sort of travel accounts, and also wrote for the Bremer Gallery catalog at which Brancusi's work was presented. These people all shared this romance and mythology of America. It seems to have a kind of key role in modernist thinking, in the thinking of the creators of Cubism and abstract art, or at least some of them in this period. Another third thing, and then I'll pass it back, that I think comes out in the story is this idea of the monumental, this idea of working large. Brancusi came to New York, saw the skyscrapers, and imagined a kind of metaphor of his own studio, or his own studio as a kind of metaphor. In other words, architecture and sculpture united together in a larger concept. Many artists in this period came to New York and saw suddenly the possibility of working big, in big scale, of working at the scale of skyscrapers, and again Léger, who was a kind of companion. Imagine, for example, in 1939, the idea of murals that would be projected light onto the skyscrapers of the city and so forth. So in terms of the importance of the American market and patronage, in terms of New York as a kind of fantasy idea for French artists, modern artists, and in terms of the idea of the big city as a point of inspiration for monumental creation, Brancusi, and I think this book really brings these points home very, very well, both distinguishes himself and exemplifies a larger pattern. I'll pass it back.
Yes, Matthew, thank you. Actually, I'm very happy that Matthew is here, because I count also in the book how much those New York collectors of that time, of Brancusi's time, were not only collectors, but like huge supporters, because they were the main clients of his works. And among them, of course, the first big one was John Quinn, who started to collect Brancusi in 1914, and who will purchase 33 sculptures of Brancusi between 1914 and 1924, when he passed away, sadly, very young. And the other great body of works by Brancusi collected by one person, one couple, is the collection of Walter and Louise Arensberg, who purchased their first Brancusi in 1915, I think, introduced to Brancusi through their common friend and great mentor, Marcel Duchamp. And actually, in 1950, they bequeathed their collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I would like, Matthew, you to explain how come this collection from this New York couple arrived in Philadelphia, which make Philadelphia Art Museum the largest collector of Brancusi today.
We were talking about this other part of the story, which is the way in which private collections eventually migrate and move into museum collections. And it's true that initially it was John Quinn who was the foremost American collector and therefore also worldwide collector of Brancusi. And he did die young, and his collection was dispersed at auction. And it's also true that Marcel Duchamp is a very important figure in this story. He's also, of course, a French artist who had a very, very close connection to New York, spent several important periods of his life in the United States. Even more importantly, was constantly or very often going back and forth. And as someone who was an artist who also helped to put important collections together and was involved in the market, he became very concerned at the moment of the John Quinn sale that what Quinn had assembled in Brancusi not be dispersed to the winds through this sale after the collector's death. So there was a project of, in effect, buying back the Brancusis to keep them together. That's one thing. Duchamp was very closely connected to, as many of us I'm sure know, other important collections of modern art, including Catherine Dreyer and the Société Anonyme collection, and also, as we were just saying, the collection of Walter and Louise Arensberg. The Arensbergs, of course, the holders of maybe the most important avant-garde salon in New York, the great Dada salon in New York, in their house during World War I, living practically in close proximity with Duchamp during this time, becoming the foremost collectors of Duchamp. They spent the last decades of their lives in California and Los Angeles, and then in the 40s started thinking about what to do with their collection, which by now had grown to become the principal private collection of Brancusi also. They were courted by a number of American museums, the Arensbergs. But at the end of the day, it was the Philadelphia Museum of Art and its director, Fisk Kimball, which won out. And Duchamp was very closely connected to all this. He was very concerned not only that his own life's work in the Arensberg collection stay together, but he was also concerned that the rest of what the Arensbergs had be put in the right museum setting, and they eventually decided that Philadelphia was that setting. The gift, as we said, happened in 1950. In 1954, the Arensberg collection in Philadelphia was unveiled, Duchamp himself helping to install his own works and Brancusi's works. So in a way, this is a great story of how, through the efforts of patrons, over a certain amount of time, the essence of an artist's life work gets placed in a great permanent home.
We have the chance to have with us Jean-Jacques Neuer, who is the representative of the Brancusi estate. And so I would be curious, and I'm sure our audience is curious, to know more the story of the estate, because the show in New York right now, Untitled Brancusi, New York 1913-2013, is presenting a body of work belonging to the estate of Brancusi. So how come the estate of Brancusi organized that?
Yes. Today we celebrate Brancusi in New York. And Brancusi, of course, is the inventor of, in a certain sense, of the contemporaneity and the modern art. And Brancusi died in 1957. He left behind him a huge work in the sense that it has influenced all the 20th century, but the number of the works was very little, 220, 200 something. So it's a very remarkable situation to see how we have here a big artist, immense artist, probably the biggest sculptor of the 20th century, and so few works, 220. And Brancusi has chosen to appoint his very close friends who used to work with him, Istrati and Dumitrescu, and he appointed them universal legatees of his work. Huge responsibility, because it's the life between of Brancusi after his death. In a certain sense, they were in charge of his legacy for the years to come. So in 1957, Istrati and Dumitrescu were the universal legatees, but also Brancusi bequested the plasters, the original plasters of his works, this studio, what was in his studio, to the Centre Pompidou. Not the Centre Pompidou at that time, but the French state. It is collected today by the Centre Pompidou. And in the meantime, all these original plasters were taken by Istrati and Dumitrescu, who made molds directly from the original plasters. And there was a huge litigation, very well known by the academics and the historians, between Istrati and Dumitrescu on one hand and the French state on the other hand. And what is remarkable here is that the Supreme Court, the French Supreme Court, la Cour de Cassation, finally decided that yes, the will of Brancusi had to be respected, and Istrati and Dumitrescu were absolutely right to make reproductions. They could make reproductions which will be original, as they have been made from the original plasters. They decided to make some reproductions, but in very, very little quantity, very often less than 8+4, as you know that it is authorized by the law to make up to 12 casts. And sometimes they decided to make 3, 5, depending on essentially the size of the works. And when Dumitrescu died, in turn she bequested everything to her nephew, Theodore Nicole, who is the representative of the Brancusi estate and the council. And Theodore Nicole was the sole legatee of the Brancusi estate. So, as you know, Auguste Comte, as he put it once, said, humanity is equally made of alive and dead human beings. And we live today in a very specific time when there are more human beings alive in one generation than all the human beings who ever been on this planet. And this, in my opinion, put the question of the accessibility of these works. 200-something works, very few, and an immense demand and need of the market to see works by Brancusi. And I think that the real point now is to control this market and to avoid that it becomes hectic, as when there is such a need to see Brancusi, such a need to show Brancusi, we had to continue these editions, but with all the academical contingencies and rules needed. And of course, these editions are very rare, will be very rare, are still very rare. And we are very proud to celebrate Brancusi in New York and the 100 years of Brancusi in New York, and to show you that he is still alive here in this temple of the modernity.
Before to ask the audience for eventual questions, I would like Matthew to tell us, considering this enormous collection the Philadelphia Art Museum owns, how is it displayed, and what is for you the message of this art, of Brancusi's art in today's world?
At the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we have, I believe, 17 Brancusis from the Arensbergs, plus 3 other sculptures. I'm speaking only of sculptures. 3 other sculptures, 2 from another foundational modern art collection for our museum, which is the Gallatin collection. And you put it together, you get 20, and a certain number of these are displayed in a kind of very special chapel-like gallery at the Philadelphia Museum, just next door to the Duchamp Gallery, so that in a way we commemorate there's some very, very important historical connection between two of the leading figures in modern art. And of course, in such a space, in a sequence of rooms devoted to modern and contemporary art, you have nothing but connections. You know, you have connections to what you might call the international constructivism of the 20s and 30s, which is another high point of our collection. But if you move elsewhere, you start to make connections with more recent years and decades, as Jérôme was saying, and as he discussed in his book. There's a quotation in the Brancusi New York book from Pontus Hultén, the great museum director and curator. And he says something like Brancusi invented three of the most important contemporary ideas in sculpture. One is seriality. Right? Another is the environmental quality of sculpture. And the third is in a sense, he became the incubator of what would become minimal art. And, you know, that's all right. And really, when you start thinking about it that way, it's very difficult not to find Brancusi in what came after and what is coming today. Because, of course, the notion of seriality, the notion of the multiple original, the notion of a dialogue between the object and the environment, the idea of industrial materials. We talked about Dan Flavin a moment ago. All of these things are, of course, perfectly ubiquitous today, and they, in a way, maybe teach us a lesson about the continuation of the modern and the contemporary.
Thank you. You know, there is Brancusi used to write several aphorisms, and there is a lot of manuscript notes, like studio notes, and he was writing some very strong ideas time to time. And among all those aphorisms, one is for me the key to talk about the relevance of Brancusi in today's creation. Brancusi said, "Simplicity is complexity resolved." And I think that's something we can all meditate. And recently, a great architect was telling me how much it was important, this quotation, also for all the contemporary architecture, for example. So it's really something, I think, which can summarize all the power, the relevance of Brancusi art in today's creation. But now, if you allow me, I think that we can ask to the audience if there is questions. I know that there is a microphone. So is there any question?
I'm curious about the quality control over these very, very posthumous casts, and also precisely when the molds were made. I'm assuming that they were not done in Brancusi's lifetime either, but perhaps I'm wrong.
The molds were made just after the death of Brancusi from the original plasters. So it's exactly what was at stake during this lawsuit I mentioned. So the casts are exactly exactly like the plasters. And when Brancusi left these plasters behind him, we can assume that his will was exactly to have these casts reproduced and to have these casts made. This is made, of course, in a very precise way, respecting absolutely the edition which has been decided by Straton Dumitrescu after the death of Brancusi. So it's in a very limited number, and in any case, no more than 8 plus 4 artist proofs.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. The first relates to the last question, which is how many Brancusi sculptures were sold in his lifetime compared to how many exist today? In other words, there are 2 numbers. How many were sold in his life, made in his life, and how many are there now in existence?
So, well, for the historical part, he produced during his lifetime a body of 220 works, which explains first the rarity of Brancusi's works in the museums, and how much he was. There is 2 explanations for this number. For example, if you take what the comment in 1955 during the museum retrospective at the Guggenheim, people pointed out that 90% of those works were sold in the US. So I think he produced a very limited number, also for sort of quite negative reason, which is the lack of customers. Do not forget that he had his first solo show in a gallery. He was 38 years old in 1914 at the 291 Gallery in New York. Moreover, I think that today, if you see the catalogue raisonné, or the tentative of the catalogue raisonné, catalogue raisonné is never totally complete, but that Pontus Sultan made in 1986, you can see that there is also the posthumous cast registered in the catalogue raisonné, and basically it's a very, very limited, so to exactly count today, which is your question, how many works of Brancusi are existing in the world, I would say that it is around 200, maybe 50, something like this. It is very, very. It is very, because you can see in this book, and you can track where are the limited editions, and they are mostly 90% of them in museums. So, for example, when you go at the Pierre Gianada Foundation in Switzerland, and you see this Grand Coq in steel, it's one, but there is only one like that existing. Brancusi made the plaster, but he didn't have the time to execute the cast. When you go to some museums in Japan, you have a couple of museums of Japan where you have one Brancusi work in a couple of museums. It is belong to this body of work, posthumous. You have that also in Germany, in UK, in France, in a couple of museums. So it's very, very rare, and it's why also Brancusi, and it was a motivation also for me to write this book, because I thought that it was paradoxically, because of this rarity, Brancusi is not enough known or renowned at the level he should be, considering his relevance to understand today's contemporary world. For example, you all know that the most famous artists, modern artists, are the ones who have the biggest actuality, you know, the biggest news. And what are the news in the art world? It's the museum shows, the gallery shows, in the fairs. And for example, to take the most famous competitor of in a way, of Brancusi, Picasso, he produced so much during his life that there is always at auction house, every auction there is Picasso's. Every single year there is many shows all around the world. So you have this permanent actuality of Picasso, for example, which, and I take this example because Picasso produced a huge body of work, and Brancusi is a bit the other extreme. He produced a very small body of work compared to the fact that he passed away. He was 81, and he started very young to make sculpture. So he had quite a long career, but as a matter of fact, a very small body of work.
Okay, so that was, thank you. That was only my first question. So, but I do agree with you. It's difficult.
I see Claudio.
Can I go? Sure.
There is another
question,
yeah,
which
sure.
is how do you regard the photographs that he made, Brancusi's photographs?
So that's, thank you for this question, because actually I talk quite a lot about Brancusi's photographs, and in the show in New York we displayed some photographs. Brancusi learned photography with Edward Steichen, his neighbor in Paris, and then Man Ray, to go to you are dreaming about having masters like that. And why he developed so much photography? Because again, his customers, his collectors were living in America. He was living in Montparnasse in Paris. And so John Quinn will say, send me photos before ordering the casts. So because he was not happy with the photographs from other people, he made himself photography. And what is interesting is what is the essence, the identity, the specificity of Brancusi's photographs, especially for the polished bronze. It's very radiative, it's overexposed, it's like a big flash of light. He insists on the mirror effect. You can see actually within the work the whole backdrop and sometimes himself. It's like a self-portrait, a mirror. He used to say, and I linked that with a quotation by him, another aphorism. He used to say, art is like a mirror in which each of us can see what we think. Isn't it a good conclusion for Matthew, your conclusion?
No, I'll just say thank you very much. It's impossible to top that.
Thank you. Thank you to you.